For 12 seasons, audiences watched a soft-spoken mystery novelist named Jessica Fletcher wander through a tiny coastal town in Maine and somehow stumble onto a fresh corpse almost every single week. The show was Murder, She Wrote. It ran on CBS from 1984 to 1996, and it turned Angela Lansbury into one of the most beloved performers in television history. But behind the cozy small-town charm, there's a surprising amount of strange trivia, hidden tributes, real Hollywood history, and at least one statistic that should have made Cabot Cove, Maine, the most terrifying place on the planet to take a vacation. What's interesting about this show, looking back at it now, is how much of its identity was shaped by decisions that happened well off-screen, casting choices that almost went a completely different direction, a real family quietly running the production in its later years, and statistical quirks that nobody involved in making the show could have anticipated when it premiered in 1984. Here are 15 facts about Murder, She Wrote that even longtime fans might not know. Murder, She Wrote ran for 264 episodes, and that meant a constant rotation of guest actors playing suspects, victims, and witnesses. Looking back at the cast lists now is a strange experience, because so many of those guest spots belong to people who later became massive stars. A young Joaquin Phoenix, credited at the time under the name Lee Phoenix, appeared in the very first season. George Clooney showed up in 1987 playing a young man caught in the middle of a wedding connected to his father's old comedy partner. Bryan Cranston appeared multiple times across the series, including one memorable early role where his character meets an untimely end involving a car bomb, decades before he'd become known for an entirely different kind of chemistry. Courtney Cox appeared as Jessica's niece in a Season 3 episode, years before Friends made her a household name. Neil Patrick Harris also turned up, playing a delivery boy wrongly accused of murder, not long after his breakout role as Doogie Howser. Taken individually, these are fun bits of trivia. Taken together, they paint a picture of a show that quietly functioned as an audition reel for the next generation of Hollywood leading men and women, most of whom probably hoped nobody would remember they once played a murder suspect in Cabot Cove. This is the fact that tends to break people's brains a little. Cabot Cove, the small, idyllic seaside town where Jessica Fletcher lived, was estimated to have a population of around 3,500 to 3,560 people. Over the course of the show's 12-season run, roughly 60 murders were tied directly to that town. In 2012, the BBC Radio 4 program more or less did the math for fun, and the result was staggering. Based on an average of about 5.3 deaths per year in a population of 3,560, the math worked out to roughly 1,490 murders per million people. That put Cabot Cove ahead of Honduras, which at the time held the real-world record for the highest national murder rate. Cabot Cove's rate was about 60% higher. For comparison, the BBC also looked at Midsummer Murders, the long-running British mystery series, and found its fictional county had a murder rate of about 32 per million, meaning Cabot Cove was dozens of times more dangerous than even one of its closest competitors in the cozy mystery genre. It's worth noting the analysis was explicitly described as tongue-in-cheek, but the underlying numbers were drawn from the actual episode count. Some outlets have mistakenly reported a figure of 274 murders for Cabot Cove specifically, but that number actually represents the total murders Jessica solved across the entire series, including cases that took place far outside her hometown. The 60 murder figure for Cabot Cove itself is still extraordinary for a town that size, and it's the number that gave rise to the long-running joke that anyone who saw Jessica Fletcher walking toward their house with a casserole should probably consider relocating. Murder, She Wrote wasn't just randomly assigning a killer at the end of each episode. The show was built in the tradition of fair play detective fiction, a style of mystery writing that has roots going back to the golden age of crime novels in the 1920s and 30s, when writers like Agatha Christie were setting the template for the genre. The basic idea is simple. The audience should have access to every clue the detective has, and a sharp viewer should theoretically be able to solve the case before the big reveal. To make this work episode after episode, the writers leaned on a few consistent tricks. The camera would often linger just a beat too long on something that seemed unimportant, an object on a table, a detail in the background, and that lingering shot was usually the tell. The show also liked to play against type with its casting. The guest star who seemed the most aggressive, the most obviously suspicious, with the clearest motive, was very often innocent. Meanwhile, the quiet, sympathetic character who barely seemed to register was frequently the one to watch. It's a structure that rewards repeat viewing, because once you know the pattern, you start noticing how often the show telegraphs its twists in plain sight. There's also a practical reason this approach worked so well for a weekly series. Fair play mysteries require a lot of structural discipline. Every episode needs at least a handful of characters with plausible motives, a killer who's been visible from early on, and a resolution that holds up to scrutiny. Maintaining that formula across more than 260 episodes, year after year, without the mechanics becoming obvious or repetitive, is a genuinely difficult writing challenge. Part of why the show held onto such a loyal audience for over a decade was that it rarely cheated. The answer was always technically available to anyone paying close attention, even if most viewers were too busy enjoying Jessica's company to actually solve it themselves. For a character constantly traveling around the world and showing up at crime scenes on multiple continents, Jessica Fletcher had one very specific limitation. She didn't drive. No license, no car of her own. She got around Cabot Cove on foot or by bicycle, and relied on other people for rides everywhere else. Angela Lansbury herself addressed this in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, saying she wasn't entirely sure why the choice was made originally, but that she'd come to appreciate it. Her reasoning, as she explained it, was that not having Jessica drive ruled out the need for car chases, and television already had plenty of shows built around fast driving and dramatic chase scenes. From a production standpoint, it also turned out to be useful. Putting Jessica in someone else's passenger seat gave the writers a built-in excuse for a one-on-one conversation, which is exactly the kind of scene a detective show needs constantly. Despite being set on the rocky coast of Maine, Cabot Cove was almost entirely a California production. Most interior scenes were filmed on sound stages at Universal Studios in Universal City, while exterior shots were captured in the town of Mendocino, in Northern California. Mendocino's Victorian architecture and dramatic coastline gave the production a passable stand-in for New England, and filming there was considerably cheaper than sending a crew across the country to Maine. The Blair House in Mendocino served as the exterior of Jessica's home, while the harbor in nearby Fort Bragg was used for many of the dockside and waterfront scenes. However, the production only shot new material on location in Mendocino for about 9 episodes across the entire run. After that, the crew relied on stock footage and shifted most of the work back to the studio lot in Los Angeles. Back at Universal, the Jaws Lake area of the back lot was used to stand in for the village exteriors, with a relocated Victorian-style house serving as Jessica's home whenever the script called for additional exterior shots. The downside of working on a Southern California lot for a show set in Maine is exactly what you'd expect. Palm trees occasionally show up in the background of scenes that are supposed to be taking place in New England, a detail that's hard to miss once you know to look for it. When Murder, She Wrote went international, a lot of countries decided the literal English title didn't quite capture what they wanted. The results range from elegant to almost comically blunt. In Italy, the show became known by a title that translates roughly to The Lady in Yellow, a reference to giallo, the Italian term for mystery and crime fiction that dates back to a popular book series from the late 1920s known for its bright yellow covers. In Germany, the show eventually settled on a title that translates to something like Murder is Her Hobby, which is a delightfully matter-of-fact way to summarize Jessica Fletcher's entire life. France went with arabesque, evoking the intricate, interlocking patterns associated with the well-constructed mystery plot. In Japan, the show was rebranded around the idea of Aunt Jessica's Case Files, leaning into her warm, approachable persona. Spain kept things close to the original with a title that translates directly to A Crime Has Been Written. The through line across all these versions is the same. Different countries, looking at the exact same show, found completely different angles to sell it. The genre, the hobby, the warmth, or the literary wordplay. It's an easy comparison to make. An older woman, living in a small town, who keeps stumbling onto murders and solving them through quiet observation. That's basically the description of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple. And the creators of Murder, She wrote, Richard Levinson, William Link, and Peter S. Fisher were certainly working in that tradition. The show's title itself was inspired by the 1961 film, Murder, She Said, which was based on a Miss Marple novel, and Jessica's character was influenced by both that film's heroine and by Agatha Christie as an author. But the creators weren't simply trying to recreate Miss Marple in an American setting. Their goal was broader. They wanted to fill what they saw as a gap in American television, which didn't really have a strong tradition of amateur female sleuths the way British mystery fiction did. So rather than transplanting an existing character, they built someone new, drawing inspiration from Christie's own life and career as a prolific mystery writer. Producer Peter Fisher also made a point of giving Jessica an active lifestyle, jogging, cycling around town, which was a notably different portrayal of a woman in her 50s and 60s than most American television offered in 1984. It's hard to imagine anyone other than Angela Lansbury as Jessica Fletcher, but she very nearly wasn't cast at all. The role was first offered to Jean Stapleton, fresh off 9 years playing Edith Bunker on All in the Family. According to Lansbury, Stapleton turned it down because she had recently lost her husband and didn't want to take on a new project at that time. The role then went to Doris Day, who also declined. Some accounts suggest Day was later approached about a guest appearance on the show and made a specific request that her son receive a producer credit with pay. And when the studio agreed to compensate her but wouldn't extend that credit to her son, she never appeared on the series at all. Only after both of those names had passed did the creative team turn to Angela Lansbury, someone they believed would be perfect for the role, but weren't sure would even be interested in committing to a television series. Lansbury herself later said that when she read the script, it felt like it could have been written specifically for her, and that she was drawn to playing one of the few substantial roles available for a woman on television at the time. She'd spent most of her career on stage and in film by that point, and the opportunity to lead a network drama at 58, in a role built around intelligence and competence rather than glamour, was something she found genuinely rare. Two of the biggest names in American entertainment turned the part down, and in doing so, handed Angela Lansbury a role that would define the rest of her career. Over the course of the show's run, she earned 10 Golden Globe nominations and 12 Emmy nominations for the part, winning 4 Golden Globes along the way, and she holds the record for the most Emmy nominations ever received by an actress for a single dramatic role. From the beginning, Angela Lansbury had a clear sense of who Jessica Fletcher was supposed to be, and she pushed back whenever scripts threatened to undermine that. She was careful about the small physical details, how Jessica reacted to information, how she asked questions, the way she noticed things other characters missed, and she resisted any version of the character that came across as out of touch, overly eccentric, or condescending toward the people around her. This wasn't just a passive preference. Lansbury and co-creator Peter Fisher had real disagreements over the years about workload and pay, disagreements serious enough that she came close to leaving the show entirely. Rather than walking away, she eventually moved into a producing role on the series, which gave her direct influence over the direction the character and the show would take for its final seasons. Jessica Fletcher's full name was Jessica Beatrice Fletcher, and her maiden name was McGill. That detail wasn't picked at random. Angela Lansbury's mother was the Belfast-born actress Moyna McGill, who had a long career in West End theater and appeared in several films, including a few alongside her daughter. It's a quiet piece of personal history folded into the character, the kind of detail that means nothing to a casual viewer but carries real weight for anyone who knows Lansbury's own family background. Every time Jessica's maiden name came up over 12 seasons, it was a small, unannounced nod to the actress's own mother. By the early 1990s, Angela Lansbury's production company was co-producing the series alongside Universal, and she eventually took over as executive producer for the show's final seasons. Once she had that influence, Lansbury developed a reputation for casting performers from earlier eras of Hollywood, actors whose careers had slowed down but who still needed work. Part of the reason for this had a very practical dimension. Actors in the United States generally need to earn a minimum amount through union work each year to maintain their health coverage through SAG, the Screen Actors Union. A guest role on a popular network show could be enough, on its own, to help an actor qualify for that coverage for the year. Lansbury reportedly used recurring and guest roles on Murder. She wrote to help several veteran performers in exactly this kind of situation, without making any public statement framing it as a deliberate policy. It became one of the quieter, lesser-known aspects of how the show operated behind the scenes, and part of why the set developed a reputation as an unusually warm place to work. Murder, she wrote, wrapped its original 12-season run in 1996, but it was followed by 4 television movies between 1997 and 2003. Those films sent Jessica Fletcher to new settings, including a cross-country train trip, a writers' conference, an investigation tied to her own family history in the South, and finally a trip to Ireland for a reading that, predictably, turned deadly. The character's afterlife didn't stop with the films. In 2012, a video game called Murder, She Wrote 2, Return to Cabot Cove, was released, following an earlier hidden object mystery game in the same franchise. These games used likenesses of the original cast members, without the original actors providing voices. Between the TV movies and the games, Jessica Fletcher's career as an amateur detective stretched out for nearly 2 more decades after the original series ended, proof that audiences never really lost their appetite for Cabot Cove, even after CBS moved on. By the late 1980s, heading into the show's 5th and 6th seasons, the production schedule had become genuinely grueling for Angela Lansbury, who was in her early 60s at the time and carrying the lead role in nearly every episode. To ease that load, the producers tried something unusual. For a stretch of episodes, they introduced a rotating cast of substitute investigators who would carry the main mystery, with Lansbury appearing only in shorter opening and closing segments as Jessica. The substitute characters included a charming former jewel thief, a gruff private investigator, and a smooth international agent, all reasonably well-executed characters in their own right. But the experiment didn't land with audiences. Ratings for these episodes ran noticeably lower than the standard format, making it clear that viewers weren't tuning in for the Mystery of the Week format in isolation. They were tuning in for Jessica Fletcher specifically. The show quietly moved back to its original format, with Lansbury back at the center of every episode for the remainder of the series. For more than a decade, Murder, She Wrote was one of the most dependable shows on television, anchoring CBS's Sunday night lineup with consistently strong ratings. Then, in 1995, the network made a scheduling decision that effectively signed the show's death warrant. CBS moved Murder, She Wrote from its long-held Sunday slot to Thursday nights, putting it in direct competition with NBC's must-see TV lineup, which at that point included Friends in its 2nd season, one of the most popular shows on television. The results were immediate and severe. The show lost a substantial portion of its audience in a single season, as viewers either couldn't find it in its new slot or had already settled in to watch NBC on Thursday nights. CBS framed the move as part of a broader effort to reshape its schedule, giving Sunday nights over to programming aimed at younger viewers, while using the Thursday slot as something of a consolation placement for an aging hit. Whatever the network's reasoning, the practical effect was that one of CBS's most reliable franchises was placed directly in the path of the most dominant sitcom of the era, and it didn't survive the collision. After 12 seasons, the show ended, not because viewers had lost interest, but largely because of where the network chose to put it. By the time Murder, She Wrote reached its final stretch of seasons, it had become something close to a family operation behind the camera. Angela Lansbury's husband, Peter Shaw, had co-founded a production company in the late 1980s that eventually became a co-producing partner on the series alongside Universal. When Lansbury formally stepped into the role of executive producer for the show's last several seasons, that meant the creative direction and a significant portion of the business side of the show were being overseen by people connected through one household. Lansbury's son, Anthony Pullen Shaw, directed dozens of episodes across the series' run. Her stepson, David Shaw, worked his way up through the production team and eventually served as a producer, including on some of the later television movies. Her brother, Bruce Lansbury, also contributed as a writer and producer at various points. The result was a show that, by its later years, maintained a remarkable level of creative consistency. The same tone, the same pacing, the same sense of place, at a point in its run when most long-running series have noticeably drifted from what made them work in the first place. Part of that consistency came down to the fact that, behind the scenes, it really was a family keeping watch over Cabot Cove. Looking back at the full arc of the show, that family involvement helps explain a lot of what made Murder, She Wrote feel different from other long-running network dramas of its era. Series that run for over a decade often go through visible changes in tone as new writers, producers, and executives rotate through, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. Murder, She Wrote largely avoided that drift, in part because the people steering the show in its later years had been close to it, in one way or another, almost from the beginning. It's a small piece of behind-the-scenes trivia, but it goes a long way toward explaining why a show built around one woman, one town, and an ever-growing pile of bodies